All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today and for joining all of our sessions today. We have a intentionally packed lineup for this virtual policy summit. And as Bryce mentioned at the outset, if you caught his opening remarks, we're going to have the availability of anyone who registered for this summit to be able to watch recordings of sessions that they've missed. So really appreciate you all joining this one live. I especially appreciate it as the moderator. I'm Mark Yulesman. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Hope Center for College Community and Justice. And we're here for a really exciting breakout session on the future of emergency aid. And I'm joined by three amazing panelists for whom I'm going to get out of the way in just a second here. But I did want to provide a few housekeeping notes and some context setting before we begin a discussion today. So we're here for the next hour. Noon Eastern time, there will be we'll finish here and then there will be a half-hour break in the programming. And then we'll have another set of sessions that folks can join at 12:30. So we're here. So get cozy, get comfortable, to talk about emergency aid for the next hour. One other note that this conversation, I don't know if there are any, I haven't checked the participant list in the chat, but if there are any press, but this conversation is also off the record. We're fortunate to have some staffers here who were willing to join and engage in an open dialogue about an incredibly important topic. So we're just going to try to keep it open and keep it amongst ourselves, or amongst those who registered for the conference, I should say. And then finally, for those who have questions throughout, the chat feature Zoom webinars have all kinds of different flavors, but there is a Q&A function. So if you have a question that comes up while we're chatting and answering any questions, please feel free to put it in the Q&A and one of us will flag it and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can, towards the end, or if there's something that comes up that's clarifying right in the middle, we'll take it then. So thanks again for everyone for joining. So as I said, I'm Mark Yulesman. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy here at Hope. I'm particularly excited to talk about emergency aid today because, emergency aid is the type of program or benefit that I think really bridges the gap between our systems, our traditional systems of financial aid, and also our various cash assistance programs, and just getting our sort of what I call getting money to people programs, both of which we know when they're designed and they're delivered well and delivered efficiently can have really, I don't think you can overstate the impact on student success. And emergency aid is not a new concept. We know that institutions have had emergency aid programs for many years, and there have been some really great evaluations of emergency aid programs. But obviously in 2020 and 2021, we saw that emergency aid became really the bedrock of the federal response to the COVID-19 pandemic for higher education and for students in higher education in particular. And we know that this type of aid, right, this sort of the type of flexible emergency aid is both desperately necessary to help students who we know struggle with basic needs and security, from food to housing to childcare, and on down the line. But it really can be the difference between staying enrolled in a degree program and not, or leaving school due to an unexpected expense. And we at the Hope Center have done fairly considerable research on emergency aid, and we see time and again that students mention that emergency aid, one of the top, if not the top thing that they mention about emergency aid is this helped me stay enrolled, that they consistently cite the ability to use emergency aid to meet unexpected or basic needs, and it keeps them enrolled, right? It's like the number one thing that's mentioned in our survey. And being one late rent payment, one grocery bill, one medical bill, one car breakdown away from dropping out of college is simply a reality that we know from our research and the work that you all are doing around the country, that's a reality that too many students share. And so now we have a precedent at the federal and institutional, and we'll talk about state level in terms of programs that respond to that reality. So we're here to talk to three folks who can talk a lot more than I can about this stuff, and who've really been on the front lines, particularly at the policy level and others, similar programs that can address the emergency needs of students. So in alphabetical order, no special order than alphabetical, Brennan Barber is an education policy advisor in the office of Senator Tina Smith of Minnesota. He previously served as a legislative assistant with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, and former Congresswoman Lois Capps. Jennifer Dellinger is the policy associate for the Student Supports Program at the Washington State Board for Community and Technical Colleges. Her oversight includes programs called Workforce, BFET, Student Emergency Assistance Grant, which we'll talk about a bit, and the Supporting Students Experiencing Homelessness program. So Jennifer's got a wealth of knowledge about how the different intersecting basic needs of students can be met by state policy programs. And last but not least, Antoinette Flores is the Senior Director for the American Rescue Plan Act implementation. I think I have that right, at the Department of Education's Office of Post-Secondary Education. And prior to joining the Department of Education, Antoinette most recently served as the Managing Director for Post-Secondary Education at the Center for American Progress. So thank you all so much for being here today. Really excited to get to a discussion about this crucial topic. So I'm going to start with Antoinette. Because you, as the person who's on the front lines of implementing the most recent round of higher education emergency relief fund dollars, sort of federal response to the pandemic, HEERF, as we colloquially know it, was one of the first and definitely the largest federal commitment to flexible emergency assistance for students. And I'm wondering if you can kick us off with a little bit about what the department has learned or what you have learned personally through 3 rounds of funding and distribution of emergency aid funds. What have we learned about implementing that we can apply in the future?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mark, and thanks so much for having me. Working on the HEERF program has been an honor, and I've learned a lot. So I'm happy to be here today. You're absolutely right. The funding provided under the HEERF program has been unprecedented, in particularly the funds that have been dedicated for emergency financial aid. A couple of years ago, this would have been unimaginable. And for many institutions, it was really a great experiment almost. But I want to start with recovering from the pandemic has been one of the top priorities from the Biden-Harris administration coming in. It remains a priority, and that's one of the reasons why President Biden signed the American Rescue Plan, which provided $40 billion to higher education, almost half of which was directly for students, and which more than doubled previous relief amounts. The pandemic at the department, and I think across the country, has changed the way we approach higher education. Students across the country, all at the same time, were struggling with things like mental health, housing, and food insecurity. But it was also like holding up a mirror. These weren't new problems. It just helped focus and made institutions much more aware of the challenges that their students faced, and with the capacity to act on them. At the department, we've worked really hard to ensure that institutions can access and use the funds, and they have the flexibility to meet their students' needs in whatever way that may be. It's going to look very different for different types of institutions and who they serve. But a couple of lessons that we've learned along the way. The first is that eligibility for emergency financial aid needs to be as broad as possible in order to serve students with the basic need, with the greatest need. So one of the first things that we did coming in was clarify the regulation so that all students can access emergency financial aid. Again, that's going to look very different for each institution based on who they serve. It can be any student that has need, and it's not just a student that receives Title IV aid, for example. The second one is that clear guidance and flexibility really makes a big difference. So we spent a lot of our time focusing on how we can provide clear guidance, examples to institutions, and that this really matters. You'll remember in the early days of the pandemic, there was a lot of money available and there wasn't a lot of guidance. And the guidance was changing. And so it almost created a kind of paralysis among institutions of what is an allowed allowable use? Is this an appropriate use? What does it mean to provide aid to students with the greatest need? That's going to vary, but it doesn't mean restricting funds based on GPA or outstanding student account balances. And so clarifying some of those things of what do we need, what do we mean by serving students with the greatest need, and how do we ensure that previous barriers that have held students back are not continuing to do so. It means detailing all of the ways that institutions can use their funds and providing examples of other institutions that are already doing that to encourage institutions. And so while emergency financial aid was a big portion of the HEERF funds, we also had institutions with a lot of institutional aid. And we wanted to encourage them to use those funds as well to support students' basic needs, their mental health. And so we had very specific guidance on that with examples of colleges doing it already. The third lesson for us was that it's made a really big difference in enrollment. The headline that you hear coming out of the pandemic is enrollment declines, but we've heard from colleges across the country that without these funds, that picture would look a lot worse. It's helped colleges keep their students enrolled. For colleges that saw large declines initially, it's helped them bring students back. And it has really made a big difference in that respect. We've also heard from students. They needed funds to cover their rent, to pay for food, not just for themselves, but for their kids, for their families. And so it's made a big difference in that respect. And finally, what we continue to hear is that the impacts are ongoing. These funds were critically important, and the need has not disappeared. So I will stop there.
Thanks, Antoinette. I really appreciate, you lifting up that, I think your wording was, these were not new problems, but what this did was gave institutions the capacity to act on those problems, which I think is something that, I'm going to assume we're in a very friendly, sort of environment here. I think a lot of us, realize the sort of, deep inequities and deep needs that students faced, certainly predated the pandemic, and the pandemic showed a light on what we already knew to be true. So thank you. I appreciate that. And we obviously appreciate the hard work that you all have been doing to, provide guidance, to untangle some of the, ambiguity for folks, and obviously to lift up how this has helped institutions and students. So I want to move to Brennan, because you all, not to toot your horn too much, but you all were very early on the federal emergency aid bandwagon before HEERF. So you all have a bill that would be great to hear you talk about, the Emergency Grant Aid for College Students Act, that would basically make emergency aid a permanent fixture in the federal role of higher ed. So if you could walk us through that bill, what's in it, why it's a priority for you all, what it hopes to accomplish, what sparked this interest for you all and your boss.
Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to do so, and thanks for the great comments, Mark, that you made earlier, and Antoinette too. It's always good to hear about the other side of a different branch of government, and how things are going over there, and the implementation perspectives. I can start with, I think, maybe just why this is a priority for my boss. Senator Smith was keenly interested in emergency grant aid starting from her time working at the state level in Minnesota. Every time she meets with college students, she asks, how many of you are working one job? Hands go up. 2 jobs, hands stay up, and 3 jobs, and many hands are still up. And that's something that predated COVID and the pandemic, and but obviously many of those issues were exacerbated, as we saw with the pandemic. So my boss has always been very interested in doing whatever we can to support students' basic needs. She found this issue particularly compelling. Minnesota has a state program to provide emergency grant aid, and both that this is something that it is, meets a real need for students, and also has such tremendous impact for student outcomes. What we know about completion, what we know about persistence, that this is making a real difference for students in their day-to-day lives and academically. So she found that very compelling, of course, and so that has been why this is a priority. The bill that we have, and there's a House version as well, would basically, as Mark said, make it a fixture in the Higher Education Act. The HEERF is tremendously important, unlike anything we've ever seen before, and a game changer in so many ways. And I think one of those things, it is not always common. We sometimes hear about the 50 state laboratory of democracy. We get to get ideas from the state level. This is really an interesting area because we've already kind of done this at a supercharged federal level with the pandemic. And we want to take that has been tremendously important, and we want to continue that going forward. So the bill would create a program to provide emergency grant aid to go to institutions in order for them to make these grants to their students. Take some of the lessons learned from the pandemic and incorporates them from the experience of actually getting that aid out the door. And that's really what it would do. It is, I think a great opportunity to support students and support improved outcomes. And my boss is, in sort of where we are now, having looked at so much of what has happened in response to the COVID pandemic, she has really looked for areas of what are the lessons learned and the not silver linings, but what are the things that we did differently that we should be carrying forward. And this definitely is in that category. So yeah.
Thanks. I love that often we talk about things shifting upwards from state initiatives to federal or institutional initiatives to federal, and this has sort of gone in, in several different directions. COVID scrambling things that in so many ways. So really appreciate your leadership on this, and the sort of response to, again, longstanding inequities that sort of drive the need for something permanent on this, right? So so Jennifer, who I should say is joining us from the West Coast, and when you ask someone to be on an 11 a.m. East Coast panel, there's a very East Coast bias to that. But Jennifer has joined us early in her day, so I definitely want to acknowledge and appreciate that, and all of our attendees who are joining us from the West Coast as well. But Jennifer, you're on the ground in Washington State, and obviously we've started by talking about federal emergency aid efforts, and we have some experience looking at individual institutions programs that provide small, or maybe not small, timely grants to students. But Washington is one of the few states that has a state program that does this. So talk a little bit about how that works in Washington, what you've learned from students and institutions navigating this program, and maybe some of the impacts.
Yes, thanks, Mark. I really love that this panel is comprised of different policy levels. It's really giving this more holistic picture. I'm so happy to be here with you all. The Washington State Legislature established the Student Emergency Assistance Grant SEAG program during our 2019 legislative session. The SEAG program is administered by the State Board for Community and Technical Colleges, and it allows Washington community and technical colleges to provide a direct monetary assistance to students experiencing unforeseen emergencies or situations that affect the student's ability to attend class. We currently have 27 of our 34 community and technical colleges offering SEAG. We are in the process of prioritizing, seeking additional funds so we can expand to all 34. Some of the key pieces of this funding include an outreach plan that includes both general and targeted efforts. So general efforts is really, those pivotal things, the flyers, the identifying the fact that they have emergency funds on their college website. And then they have to do some targeted outreach. And this really dives into the more details of identifying and notifying individual students who may need support, not just now, but in the future. So that would include, students receiving other funding and direct service support, certain income levels for students, identifying students who may be experiencing food or housing insecurity, self-reported through their applications or FAFSAs, or otherwise just looking to support homeless students. Another one is ensuring access to emergency aid funds are as low barriers possible. I mean, we've heard from lots of folks throughout this policy summit that barriers exist. So what we've done is we've really established these funds for folks to trust students, and that's like a whole paradigm shift. So colleges really have to actively listen and validate the experience of students instead of requiring documentation to verify the need. Another key feature is allow flexibility in who may apply and include students who may not necessarily meet the definition of financial need, but may be experiencing emergency situations. So not based off of the income level at all. We allow the term student to be defined broadly. It's not bound by program of study, credit load, or financial standing or need. These funds are required to be free from bias and discrimination as well. Another key feature is commitment to support beyond SEAG funds. So colleges need to have a plan to connect students in need, regardless of whether they got SEAG funding or not, to additional campus and community support services and programs. And that can include, but totally is not limited to, SNAP benefits, food banks on campuses, mental health facilities in the community, housing programs in the community. And the last one I want to share with you around the key features is colleges cannot require a student to complete the FAFSA in order to receive these emergency aids. We know that marginalized students have less success in completing the FAFSA. So in an effort to create more equitable access to receiving these funds, students cannot be required to complete that document. We do support completing FAFSA as we work with the students, whether it's our SEAG program folks or we've transitioned them into our SNAP EMT programs or others. What's really awesome about this is it also enables immigrant and refugee students to confidently seek emergency aid. Program funds can provide direct monetary aid or be paid on behalf of a student to assist them in a variety of things. Some include housing, food, transportation, childcare, and other goods and services needed for the students to continue attending classes. When I think about what have we learned, man, we've learned a lot. And what we learned early on with our very few pilot colleges allowed us to get an additional set of proviso funds in the 2021 legislative session to expand and offer it to what we're now at 27. And so I think I'll highlight three very broad things. What we're seeing student-wise is a lot of what other people have talked about. Marginalized students are impacted the most, needs go on. So one, students have many unmet needs, and colleges have often had to make a really difficult decision about which requests should be prioritized for emergency aid in order to make the funding available so they can assist a greater number of students. So there's just like this desperate need for coordinating supports both on and off campus so they can maximize what they're able to offer to keep students enrolled. Second, we've learned that housing was and continues to be #1 requested support. We've also learned that this has only gotten worse as federal pandemic aid and state eviction moratoriums have ended. There's been a huge benefit cliff here. Preliminary data from our fiscal year 22 is showing that more than 14,000 students' initial request for emergency aid was for housing. Even more had subsequent requests for housing. So with that, transportation, food, and utilities were second, third, and fourth in funding requests. And third, I think one of the most important things that we've learned is building awareness and understanding of student basic needs prevalence is critical for future opportunities to seek state, local, and federal grants or investment. And we know that just a local or state investment is not enough. We need permanency around these funds. And I will leave it there.
It's great. So a little light advocacy from Jennifer to our federal level colleagues on although, you know, I think it's folks in the same sandbox generally on the need to you know, have this be a continuous resource for states and for students. So thank you all. Really appreciate it, and really appreciate offering different, you know, like Jennifer said, levels of perspective on this, and really the opportunities, right, to make this sort of a coordinated effort between, you know, the federal government, between states, between institutions to you know, make sure we have the resources available to students so they're not leaving school because of a, you know, an emergency expense, but also that we're coordinating with other supports and programs. So I have sort of an open question to you all that you know, whoever wants to jump in, you know, please feel free. So, you know, and this is maybe more of like a tactical question, you know, so answer it how you certainly how you choose. But obviously, you know, the need is so vast among students, and you know, the need has become more acute as, you know, different pandemic flexibilities or programs have expired, as money has run out in one area. You know, sort of the need very clearly crops up. You know, Jennifer talked about that, you know, showing up in housing in particular. But obviously this, you know, need did not start with the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm wondering how, as we've moved through and past the policy making moment of COVID-19, right? The sort of we're no longer sort of in the immediate emergency response to it. We're just dealing with the long-term lingering effects, right? As we move beyond that moment, how do we make the case for emergency aid as a permanent feature of higher ed policy at schools, at states, at the federal level, when it's not, you know, an unprecedented emergency policy making moment, if that makes sense. So I'll have anyone can chime in on that.
I'll jump in. I think, you know, one of the things that the department is focused on, and that we'll continue to focus on, but I think that would be really important here, is telling the story. So you have a unique situation where more than 5,000 colleges across the country have received and had the experience of distributing emergency financial aid. That is a humongous sample size with very different stories on what that impact has been. And so one of the things, you know, we hope to do is to continue telling that story individually on what that has meant for colleges, what that has meant for students, but also through data. So we are very close to completing and releasing our second annual collection of HEERF data, which we've worked really hard on to improve, and will give new numbers on how many students received emergency financial aid, how many institutions dedicated additional funds because the need was so great, and how great was that need. And so I think the stories matter. I think the data matters, and something that will be really important in ensuring this is a long-term thing.
I could not agree more with that. It is a really unusual situation to have done this at such a high level. I just can't say how unusual it is. I mean, Congress, you know, we know, we like to think we know what we're doing, and when we create new things, you know, we often have a lot of you know, good intention behind them, and certainly some expertise. But this is extraordinary that billions of dollars have already gone out the door for these purposes. And Antoinette, I think, you know, captured it perfectly. The stories and experience of that and the data is going to be really just essential for making the argument about why we need to continue this permanently.
And if I can just tag on just a little bit, I think we need to rethink about emergency assistance if we're transitioning to basic needs and realize that basic needs is not just about someone being in crisis. It's more about making sure daily needs are met so students can make informed educational decisions. One of my colleagues and I like to say, a student can show up in class, but a hungry brain doesn't learn a thing. Like we really need to think about basic needs. So, and what that looks like. Basic needs work is multi-layered. The ability to meet students' basic needs in a holistic way really means we need to be thinking about ways to plan for today while building for tomorrow. Retention, persistence for students looks like addressing what's immediate, what's needed short term, and then what's needed long term, not what's needed long term, and working backwards. One thing we know is in our preliminary SEAG data for federal fiscal year 22, there was more than 47,000 students requesting just the state federal emergency aid, and nearly half of those were identified as having other unmet ongoing basic needs. So really creating this systematic shift to treat basic needs as more of an opt-out opt-out versus opt-in, giving them upfront access and then saying, no, I don't need this, versus them having to search and find these supports to meet that need. Really takes it from a crisis mode to, like I said before, an ongoing daily meeting needs. The other thing I think we should think about is prioritizing those basic needs coordinated approach in order to better equip and leverage programs and funding sources. So then there's not just one set of funds students are accessing all the time. We're giving colleges a plethora of ability to coordinate these supports and services to keep students on that pathway to completion.
I want to stick on that point for just a second. I think that, Jennifer, you talked a lot about the structure of SEAG being, sort of a requirement to connect students to other supports and programs, and obviously the limited funding in any particular program, means that if you take a much more holistic, approach about what's available, you're more likely to meet the, sort of specified needs of students. Although, as we know, there's so much overlap, food students, experiencing a struggle to afford, safe, stable, affordable housing, are more likely to experience food insecurity, right? So, at the Hope Center, we are very, very, very invested in the idea of centralized resources for students, centralized programs that allow students to, have at their fingertips in a very easy, low administrative burden process, access things like emergency aid, housing supports, SNAP benefits, enroll in the public benefit programs for which they are or should be eligible. So, but I want to stick on sort of this because, I think you're all onto something that, emergency aid, one, framing it as like, here are framing it as basic needs, program, right? That this is meeting students, where they are. It's not necessarily a crisis thing. It's about literally just being able to do the things you need to do to get through your daily life and learn, but also that there are so many different ways that, students, sort of do not necessarily have supports at their fingertips to help them do those things. So I really love that. But I think like a question I have for you all is, emergency aid is just one tool for making sure students don't get bumped off track due to financial difficulties. But how do we think about it in terms of the context of all of the other programs to address basic needs? So, Antoinette, like obviously, we mentioned HEERF as like the emergency aid as sort of maybe the, the most visible pot of money, that Ed is working through to address basic needs, but it's certainly not the only one, right? Brennan, your bill is amazing, and it's one way that we're, thinking about investing in students at the federal level. And Jennifer, you are, you have an alphabet soup of programs at the state level that you're, helping coordinate, monitor, and track. How do we think about emergency aid in the context of all of the programs to address basic needs, and how can we better coordinate those, that into a more coherent policymaking space for anyone? Sorry.
Well, I often, this is what we run into when we try and coordinate all of these different funding sources across our system. And so I'll offer this as a thought too. If we're gonna think about addressing basic needs through what already exists, I think we really need to think about what are the barriers to supports that create that inequitable access. One of the biggest barriers for students is cost of attendance. Students are often denied funding because they have no room left in their financial aid packages. And what we're seeing is then, even though colleges are doing a really great job of triaging the needs and connecting to supports and services, students are forced to choose between meeting their basic needs and then their education. And basic needs is winning out and education is losing. If we can figure out ways to navigate through and or around some of the financial aid policies, and we can provide emergency aid and keep it from counting against students' cost of attendance, whoa, that would really allow colleges a better ability to coordinate supports and ensure students can receive the maximum funding needed to support their educational pathway while accessing the emergency funds to offset some of those financial aid difficulties and keep them in their education. Right now, they can't, especially if we're seeing an increase in requests during a specific quarter. Colleges are forced to tell students, sorry, we can't fund this. You've met your cost of attendance. And that's really, really, it's sad. And I know there's a lot of opportunity for colleges to be as flexible as possible, but we still run up against that unmet need piece. So I think if we're gonna really go big and bold and create ways that colleges can do this better to serve their most basic needs, like we've talked about as an upfront approach, those grants that meet the basic needs shouldn't count against cost of attendance.
Yeah, thanks. Jennifer, it's great to hear so much about the work that you all are doing, and so many institutions, I think, are working very hard to be very student-oriented, student-centered, and when it comes to these types of programs, have centralization and kind of a no wrong door policy, and I think that is really wonderful and really great. I think the point about basic needs is absolutely true. The backdrop to some of this is certainly that the Pell Grant, the cornerstone of aid, has obviously suffered a huge decline over decades now. Thanks to the Biden administration, though, and Congress, we've had some important investments there, but we have a huge hole to be digging out of when it comes to restoring, the actual promise of that program. So, that's something that I think looms large in my mind in these conversations is thinking about the decline in purchasing power there that we've seen in the program. One point on the coordination with other programs, we send a lot of programs down to you all, different streams of money, different requirements. It's sometimes not an ideal situation. Under the program set up under the bill, we do encourage coordination with other federal means tested programs and students who are eligible for those. I'm certainly reminded that at the K-12 level, right, we have our school lunch program, breakfast program is really important, and then you get to the post-secondary, and there's a lot less available, and that is something that obviously shows up for today's college students in a number of ways. Yeah, so these are all great points, and I think I would say one point on the politics a little bit is basic needs is a huge part of this conversation. I think in terms of just a messaging conversation, the emergency component seems to be helpful. That seems to be something that people react to and I think relate to. My boss would certainly make the point about today's Congress and the age of today's Congress and today's senators, and their image of often their college experience is just a vast gulf between what today students are experiencing. And so sometimes it requires, kind of putting things in a certain light in order to get traction. But yeah.
I want to echo both Jennifer and Brennan that affordability is a huge piece of the puzzle here, and ensuring all students have the resources that they need, and don't necessarily have to have these separate conversations that parcel out what needs do students have. It should be a complete picture. You are correct, Mark, that HEERF is not the only program that the Department of Education runs to address these issues. We have, many, but two I'll highlight is one is C-Campus, which is focused on helping institutions set up childcare for their students on campuses. The focus on student parents has been really helpful in that regard, and that has gone ignored for a long time. This is one of the programs that we continue to push for increased investment in. The other one is the Basic Needs Grant, which is a newer one. Of course, neither of these on the scale of things are anywhere close to HEERF, but we've learned a couple of very important lessons in thinking about the programs that we have available in conjunction with HEERF. So on C-Campus, one of the things that we have seen a lot of colleges doing is braiding the different funds that are coming in order to expand what is available on campus. So one of the institutions that we continuously highlight, Bergen Community College, they use their HEERF funds, they use their C-Campus funds in order to provide free childcare slots on their campuses. And we heard from some of the students in that have been in receipt of the benefit, and it's enabled them to stay enrolled and complete. The other thing that we have heard from colleges that are in receipt of additional funds is there's a real need for coordination on campuses. So, one campus might have someone that works part-time in the food pantry, someone else that works part-time helping connect students to housing in addition to their regular full-time job. And one of the requests that have come in for funding is we need one or two dedicated resource coordinators, which has made a really big difference. So, there is absolutely a lot of different programs and room for connecting them. The other thing I would say is that we should think about basic needs as a strategy for enrollment and completion, and not forget the why. Why does this matter? And how does this funding allow us to achieve that? What do we see in the results for students? And that I think is a really important thing not to get left behind.
Extremely well said. Yeah, and I think what you all are saying in terms of the upfront investment and the ways we can sort of leverage things as early as possible and as robustly as possible to make it so that students have an actually affordable experience. I spend a lot of time working on student debt and student debt issues, and the sort of regret that we have for not doing these up front. I mean, it shows up later, right? I mean, it shows up in terms of, students not being able to complete their program and, the consequences of that, but it also shows up in terms of, students taking on, massive amounts of debt that become a public policy crisis. So, at some point we're paying for it. So, I'll get off my soapbox there. So I think we definitely have a few minutes for audience questions. I have one that I'm going to answer, but I do want to include as many questions as you all have. So please use the Q&A function if you can, and you have a burning question for our panelists. And while you all think of that and type those up, I'm going to take one that I thought was a great question from the audience, which is, which stakeholders need to be convinced that emergency assistance is needed? Who still needs to be, I mean, Brennan, you mentioned the politics of this and, sort of age of policymakers, but like, who needs to be convinced that this is needed or should be a permanent funding stream? Like, who should be our sort of, target for our, good news, such as it is?
Sure. Yeah. I think first I would say that I see broad support in some corners of the Senate for emergency aid. I would be remiss if I did not mention the leadership of Chair Patty Murray of the Help Committee. She's been a huge champion. Obviously, Jennifer's home state senator, and is obviously the reason why that is, this was part of the HEERF and the HEERF design. So I think in some corners we're great, well situated, I guess I should say. But then also the current reality of the Senate, which is 50-50 divided, is very evenly divided, and which that means that we need bipartisan support. And that is, of course, where things get a little more complicated and a little harder to achieve. So that would be my plug, is we need bipartisan support.
I think it's also a paradigm shift for colleges, whether it's 2-year or 4-year, whether it's private. It's realizing that basic needs is prevalent on your campus sometimes is hard for exec leadership to swallow. And when that happens, there's not a forethought for creating a comprehensive design for students. I feel like Brennan hit the political side of this. I think the other side of this is that institutions just really need to be aware across the nation, who are we serving and how do we best serve them?
Yeah, I think, we spend a lot of time lifting up, there are certain institutional models. I mean, and Antoinette mentioned leadership at places like Bergen Community College, and that, there are a ton of institutions who get it right and understand the students they face, and certainly at the community college level, right? I think that there's so many amazing community college leaders who understand the needs of their students and what students are facing every day, and the sort of Herculean effort that folks are undertaking to literally get to campus, right? I think is can't be overstated. But there's plenty of institutions that may not be as aware of the scope and scale of basic needs on their campus, or that the experiences that students face, that when it is an actual an emergency, even if they're not showing up in FAFSA data or enrolled in public benefit programs, right? That this is something that really can bump students off track. So I'm going to make one more plug for questions. It is okay if folks don't have any. I think that I am happy to provide my contact information to attendees if there are other questions, as it comes up. Oh, we got one. See, I spoke too soon. From Caitlin at the Partnership for College Completion. Thanks for this great panel. I'm curious if folks could speak more about developing policy that doesn't have restricted eligibility requirements attached. Jennifer, you mentioned, sort of impact on undocumented students and refugee students. What are all the challenges that you ran into there? So, I mean, I think Jennifer and Antoinette can definitely speak to this, and I'm sure Brennan as well.
So I would say it really comes down to will and making sure that policymakers have a good understanding of who students are on college campuses. One of the big changes across the various iterations of HEERF funding was that initially funding was given out. The calculation used to distribute funding was based on first-time, full-time students. And when you look at the data, that means that places like community colleges were getting a significantly smaller side of the funds. And so Over time, that changed to also include part-time students, and it was a much more equitable distribution. But one of the things that needed to happen there is a better understanding of policymakers of exactly who it is that institutions serve, and where there may be misconceptions broadly or within our data systems that we use to kind of determine who has need and where is the greatest need.
Yeah, and I could not agree more about policymakers truly needing to understand that. The bill that Senator Smith has introduced is intentionally broadly flexible about eligibility for this very reason, and in part to shore up in statute the great work that the Department of Ed did in undoing the improper actions that happened under the DeVos era related to student eligibility and citizenship requirements. And so that certainly, particularly for this program, we've tried to make it purposefully, intentionally as flexible as possible in eligibility components.
I think we're all right there. Flexibility and intentionality is purposeful for basic needs and emergency assistance, and I think that's one thing we've been able to do with Washington State's SAG program, is really commit to centering the program and responding to students' immediate needs and connecting them with additional resources to continue their persistence in their programs. Because the program is intended to be as low barriers possible, college is focused on improving student access and providing specific kinds of supports needed. So I think that's one of the things that are critical if we're thinking about equitable access, not just to supports, but to education in general, really creating space for flexibility so colleges can serve their community's needs. And that looks different for every community. That looks different for every state. So yeah.
That's a, sorry, I'm not you all are making me noodle on on so many things. I really deeply appreciate what you all are saying about one, political will and actually making the case and understanding, the actuality facing students and the willingness to, live our values, right? And I think emergency aid is one place we can actually do that, and the Biden administration and many folks in Congress can should be proud of the ability to do that and unwind some of the things that I think were very much not living our values for a moment there, even in the early pandemic recovery policymaking moment. So time flies when you're having fun. We are almost at time. I want to thank folks deeply for joining us today. I want to thank my panelists, Antoinette, Brennan, Jennifer, for offering, sort of deep perspectives on what brought us to this moment, what we're learning and how we're sort of being purposeful, to use a word that I've heard a bunch here, in actually making policy that responds to the experiences that students actually face, not what folks might think they face. So